So the next speaker that we're going to have is also a person who's kind of been here in the trenches for a while with us. So Greg Guldner actually comes out of the military, but then he has actively been involved in the wellness of not only residents, but of faculty. So he's going to speak to you this morning just a little bit with regard to from burnout to engagement and lessons that he has learned. So welcome, Greg.
So I am an emergency physician. I have about a 2-minute attention span, the metabolism of a hummingbird, and I'm going to keep moving back and forth quite a bit. So the camera guy, sorry, I'm going to kind of go back and forth. And I want to start with a story. And I want to start with a story for a reason, because there's a lot of things I'm going to talk about that are pretty abstract. And we talk about burnout and statistics and so forth. But I want to kind of get your amygdala going here a little bit, and I want to get into the emotions. So back about mid-1990s, I was on the end of my residency program, and I went into a beginning shift. I started at 7 o'clock in the morning. And this was back in the days where not the entire universe would show up in the emergency department overnight. So we had one attending who was on from night to day, and they were supposed to be there at 7 o'clock, and then the day person would show up at 7. And along comes 7:15, and nobody showed up. And then 7:20. And all of you emergency physicians and people who work shifts know what that means. You start getting nervous about what's going on, right? Does this person forget? Did they not show up? 7:30, still not there. We start calling around, and we couldn't get a hold of this person. So we remembered that he had another job. He worked at 2 different emergency departments. So we called the other emergency department and got a hold of the medical director, and he'd shot himself the weekend before. His name was Ron. He was a friend of mine, and it got my attention. Let me tell you another story. This spring, at an institution 26 miles away from me, there was a young lady. I'm going to change the names. Her name's Lisa, and she's someone's daughter, granddaughter, and she went to high school, college, medical school, residency, completed several years in psychiatry, and she killed herself this spring. Let me tell you another story. A man named Adam, he, somebody's son, grandson, went to high school, college, medical school, anesthesia residency, 4 years of it. He killed himself this spring at the same institution. Let me tell you another story. We'll call him Josh. Josh, somebody's son, grandson, went to high school, went to college, medical school, anesthesia, knew the person before him. He killed himself this spring at the same institution. 3. Let me tell you another and the last story. So about 2003, 4, 5, I had a fantastic resident. We'll call him Mike. Mike was phenomenal. I graduated him off. I was program director. 2 years after he graduated, he calls me up. He says, I need a letter recommendation for a job. Fantastic. Happy to do it. Where are you going? He had decided he wanted to do full-time laser tattoo removal and Botox injections. I have no problem with either of those. They have a role. But I had trained him to be an emergency physician. And I felt I failed him because I had trained him how to intubate, how to put in chest tubes, how to resuscitate, how to run an ED, how to do billing and coding, but I had failed to train him how to thrive. I'm not sure I knew how to do it myself back then. But I failed him. We failed him. He's out. He's not doing this anymore. Okay? I'm Greg Guldner. I'm the program director for emergency medicine at Riverside Community Hospital out in Southern California. Why am I up here? What's my background? I grew up in Canada, so I know a little bit about different healthcare systems. And I went to Colorado for undergrad. I have a philosophy and psychology degree. And then I went to Purdue University in a PhD program in clinical psychology. I did psychotherapy for a few years, and I decided I needed to know more about the human body to really understand the things I wanted to learn. So I decided to go to medical school. I went to Stanford University Medical School, Northern California, and I made the logical transition from clinical psychology to emergency medicine, and ended up going to Loma Linda for my residency program, and left Loma Linda right into academic. So I became the associate program director. Okay? I then became program director. Went off to Iraq and Afghanistan. I've been 21 years Army Reserve, most fulfilling time of my life, without a doubt. And I came back, and I burned out, partly because I didn't have a lot of the things that caused me so much grief in the US when I was overseas. It was all mission-driven. It was fantastic. And then I came home, and I went, oh, this is awful. And I left academics, and I went into community medicine for 9 years. Then HCA decided to run a residency, and I happened to be there, and they asked me would I come over and be program director. And I went to my wife, and she said something like, "Oh my God, no, don't do it again. Are you kidding me?" And I'm serious. So we had a long discussion. Ultimately, I won, and she's a lawyer. That's not easy to win. But I did win, and we went ahead and started a residency program again. A couple things about disclosures. I actually talked to my financial person. I do not directly own any HCA stock. So one of the things I want to talk about is an important business issue of retention, the recruit, train, retain part of this, and it's intimately connected to engagement and burnout. And I just don't want anybody to feel like I personally profit from that. So I have no holdings in HCA. I have no other disclosures. Learning objectives. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I don't know how many physicians are out there versus administrators. But I do want to reintroduce the importance of physician burnout and well-being and so forth. I think you know this, so I won't spend a ton of time on that. And I'll talk about the scope within HCA. I've got data. And then I'm going to discuss methodology and results of this huge study we did over this last year. And then I'm going to propose, this is the most important thing, I want to propose a model of how we can address this. And I'm going to use a positive psychology model. What I'm not going to do, by the way, is I'm not going to talk about sleep hygiene, nutrition, not a lot about meditation, yoga, all things that are very important. But those are smaller parts. I want a bigger brush kind of look at what we're talking about. These are my partners. Riverside Community Hospital, shout out to all the RCH people over there. I was thrilled to see that we were the #1 satisfaction program in terms of resident satisfaction. I didn't know that before we came out here. And I will say we are a resource-challenged hospital. And yet we were able to do that. There's giggles over here, yeah. We were able to do that without a lot of money. And so shout out to Riverside Community Hospital, Patrick Brilliant, Todd LeCays, the group out there. Vituity is the group I work for. Obviously, whatever I do doesn't really matter an awful lot compared to all the faculty that they interact with. They've been a great partner with me. The biggest partner I have is Claremont Graduate University. CGU is connected to, if you've heard of McKenna and Pomona colleges out there, it's an elite, smaller liberal arts college. They have a division of positive organizational psychology out there. You get a PhD in it. And I have paired with them from before we started our residency program in December of 2016. They came out to our hospital, interviewed the family medicine residents, the internal medicine residents, the internal medicine faculty, my faculty, and they developed, before we started our residency, an idea of how we should build this for burnout and depression prevention and for flourishing. And so they have something that we don't have. Doctors like to think we can solve anything. It's impressive. We kind of rebuild the wheel sometimes. Positive psychology has studied wellness, burnout, and flourishing for 40 years. They have well-validated, psychometrically valid measures. They have ways of intervening. They have studied this for an awful long time. And we really haven't used them yet. And so we've started to pair with them at Claremont. HCA has helped me with that as well. I'll point out, thank you very much to Jessica Wells, who funded some of this. And Bruce, I know you have an interest in this too. Appreciate the support. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because we don't have a lot of time, but burnout, we know what this means, I think. It's a stress response, so it involves adrenaline and cortisol and so forth. The 3 components, all measured by the Maslach Burnout Inventory, that's the standard thing everybody uses. There are other measurements, but that's what most people use. One thing you're going to get if you use this term a lot, I've had millennial folks come up afterwards and say, "Stop using that," and almost in that tone. And they're saying it causes a stigma because it suggests that the root of the problem is in somebody who's weak and you personally burned out. And I understand that. I'm actually quite sensitive to that. I agree with that term, that we have to be a little careful here. And you can see Shanafelt's and Derby's quote there. I agree that the roots of this are in the organization and the structure of things. Now, the problem is I don't believe all we should do is look at fixing the structure because I can't. I cannot fix this by structure. I don't have the power. I certainly don't want to be a politician. I can't fix this, so we have to do something along the other side of this domain too. This is depression. I won't spend a lot of time on depression. We happen to use the Center for Epidemiologic Studies D or CESD scale to measure depression in our study. There are lots of devices to do that. This is positive psychology side of this. If there's anything that measures flourishing, which is the term we prefer, it's engagement at work. So engagement is this positive, fulfilling, work-related state of mind characterized by vigor, high levels of energy when you're at work. Dedication, so you're enthusiastic, you see a challenge, but it's not so challenging you can't do it. And then absorption, that's this flow or this kind of sense that you just forget time and you're involved with things. And we measured that through some engagement measures that have been validated. What is our challenge? Our profession kills people. And I don't mean by errors and mistakes, like the Institute of Medicine report. We know this. This isn't something that is made up or maybe. Our profession leads to suicides at a ridiculous rate, and we'll talk about that. So our challenge is we know that the medical training environment, medicine, I don't know, causes burnout, depression, suicidal thinking, and low help seeking. And when somebody kills themselves and we've done nothing, that's on us. Because this is no longer something that you can sit there and say, well, maybe it does. It does. Someone else had the slide up. Adam had the slide up before. All the frontline people, and kudos to emergency medicine for finally not being at the top of this after 9 years. Critical care, neurology, family medicine, OB, internal medicine. But look at the numbers more importantly. So when you look at the graph that Bruce showed earlier about the physician shortage, if you believe the studies that suggest people who are burned out have a whole bunch of problems, and I'll mention those briefly in a second, you can essentially think of them as a third to a half of a physician. If half of the doctors out there are burned out and are functioning subpar, it's a much bigger deal than what we're talking about with just shortages. So why should we care? Besides the ethical issue that our profession, we know, does this, you have a regulatory issue, right? Now, the part of this that is tricky for all the program directors is that you have the responsibility to address well-being. That's super vague. Does anybody here have a really good sense how to address well-being? I had to go to Claremont, and they said, we do. We've been doing this model for 40 years. Let's teach you. But it's a really tough concept. What does burnout lead to? I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. The literature is very good. I think we're all aware that nobody wants burned out doctors, right? The worst one on that for me is the self-regulation. As an emergency physician that has to work with everybody else at weird hours, that probably drives me the most crazy, when somebody's just being completely unregulated, we'll say. So why should we care about this? And I think I'm preaching to the choir. We have an ethical obligation here, in my mind. We've all created programs to take young men and women, sons, daughters, granddaughters, grandsons, in to train them, fully knowing that when they go into medical school, they're normal. We've got data on that. And when they come out of medical school, they're not. And then they go through residency and they get much worse. Attending land, they get a little better, maybe, sometimes not. We know that, and we have an ethical obligation to address it now, in my mind. Second, we have a regulatory obligation, and there's an economic argument that's very strong. Shanafeld wrote a beautiful paper in Annals of Internal Medicine showing the economic cost of burnout. Burnout is highly connected to retention. And if you turn over a doctor, it costs somewhere, depending on how you do the cost, $800,000, $1 million, about 2 to 3 times their salary to replace that doctor. My understanding is 2 of the big problems HCA has is nursing retention and physician retention. Those are highly linked to this. So there's 3 arguments here for burnout and depression. So today, a doctor, man or woman, will wake up, go to work, go home, usually drink alcohol, and usually use pills to kill themselves or shoot themselves. Today. At least one a day. Every day. Right? I think it was Mike Cuff who said, we can continue the status quo or we can choose to be different. When will we choose to be different? I think we have the obligation to be different and try to stop this somehow. What are the causes of burnout? If you ask doctors, they'll give you this list. And I'm not going to go through it all. 15,500 physicians, this is their list. And many of these things are very reasonable. The roots of burnout are probably in the structures that we deal with, not in individual failures. The next slide is my favorite on here, I think, maybe. When you ask doctors, how can you fix burnout? This is what they say. And when you look those over, I want you to think about how many of those are in your control. How many of these things can you fix if you believe these are true? And I have to say, really? More money will fix this? I mean, do you really believe that? I would say there's overwhelming evidence that's unlikely to be true. When you look at this list, what you ultimately get is all you need to stop burnout is to be paid more, work less, have more support, and have your patients, colleagues, and spouse be nicer to you. Right? I think that's a lovely list. It is. Do I think it's going to affect burnout? No, I don't, especially top one. That's a very Western kind of approach. If I just had more money, everything would be fine. But there is hope, and this is really important. We're at this interesting time in this interface between medical education and positive psychology, where you have Shanna Felt at Stanford, and you have, at Mayo, and you've got the Stanford folks, and you've got the positive psychology folks now coming out saying, this is our time to fix this. Because if we don't fix this, how long can you continue to have 45% of physicians burned out? And people doing your critical care training and then going into whatever the next little thing is, it's a lifestyle, something you can do with lasers or whatever. This is a slide every one of my residents know very well, because I put it up every time we do our didactics, almost every week. And it's just a model that the Claremont folks gave me that looks at engagement versus burnout. And the demands on the left there are things that usually you can't fix. Program directors have a little leeway here. We can change a few things here and there, but a lot of these are based at the institution or even the political level of things. And on the right-hand side are the resources that are brought to the table to try to balance that burnout risk. Now, institutions, and HCA would probably fall in this, usually like to focus on the individual part, because I can put together little programs to build resilience in your employees and make them do HealthStream and do all this kind of stuff. Claremont pointed out to me that that's a typical approach to wellness in these larger companies, rather than to deal with the challenges of the demands on that side. That's a much harder thing to fix. And I think that's a pitfall we in HCA need to be careful of, that you can put the burden back on the individual and just try to train them up to be more resilient or something like that. And it doesn't work very well. So this is the HCA Wellness Study. This was a study with Claremont Graduate University, myself, Riverside Community Hospital, and HCA, where what we wanted to do was, well, what I wanted to do with my very simplistic thinking about this, I went to Claremont and I said, we've got a great opportunity. Let's study all these residents and figure out how much burnout and depression is there. And they said, stop. They said, stop. We know. It's been done. It's been done over and over and over. It is time for action. Intervene. Do interventions. Let's do interventions. And I said, yeah, whoa. I cannot do all of that yet. I want to do a study looking at, what's the cross-sectional amount of depression and burnout and stuff. And after they got annoyed with me and finally succumbed to a little pressure on my side, they said, well, let's compromise. We're going to do a longitudinal study, 3 waves, of all of the residents we can get. And yes, we'll look at rates of burnout and depression. But we need to go beyond that. We want to look at a model that has been studied in positive psychology repeatedly that predicts burnout, engagement, and depression using certain variables that the positive psychology folks have studied for a long time. And let's see if it works in this environment, because we think it will. It hasn't been studied well in medical environments. But we think it will work. And if it does work, we have interventions. So I can do a study for you, says Claremont, where not only can we answer the questions been answered and asked repeatedly, but we can show that our models work. And if they do work, we can measure it with measures that we believe are very psychometrically valid, and we can intervene, and we can help. So this was a 3-wave study. It started back in November. We gave another one in March, April, and then we did the last one in September. We got 1,062 full responses, and this was a long survey. So we wanted to measure lots of things, and anyone who's done survey research, which I've done quite a bit of, you balance the amount of questions with the response rates, of course. And you've all done lots of surveys. At some point, you're like, this is silly, and you shut it down and don't finish it. So we had a fairly robust survey, which means you get a difficult response rate. Of the 1,062 full responses, 774 were individual residents. The difference between that were residents who completed the survey more than once. So they did it twice, or some of them did it all 3 times. Now, the advantage of doing it over time like that, as you all know, is if you just do cross-sectional correlations, that doesn't have a lot of causation. But you can begin to draw some causation hypotheses with longitudinal studies. And so that's our advantage here. The overall goal was to learn more about resident wellness, improve resident wellness. And then the secondary goal, because I think they're highly related, is the retention of HCA residents at HCA facilities. Think our residents are different? So when we did this study, Claremont said, "I told you so. You wasted our time. We already knew this." This is the risk for clinical depression based on the CESD score. The literature suggests it's around 30%. 30%. Just for base rate, the general population runs about 15%, and it varies by gender a little bit. But here's the risk for clinical depression of our residents in waves 1, 2, and 3. 1/3. Replicated what's out there, right? It's one of the larger studies done. How about burnout? The gray bar on the left is high levels of burnout. The blue is intermediate, the orange is low. These are our residents. Impressive. Is everybody addressing this yet? Because I can't say I am well. But this is the ethical obligation that we have. So what did the study look at? So this is where we get into some terms that you may not be familiar with. And partly why I did that little stuff at the beginning to make this more real in terms of human beings. Psychological capital was a predictor we used. This is a very well-studied concept from the positive psychology literature called psychological capital. It is not the same as resilience, although resilience is measured in here. It's measured by a thing called the PCQ. And it consists of 4 things. It consists of hope, which is the sense that I can set a goal and I can see a pathway to get there. It consists of efficacy, which is the sense that I have the ability to get a little bit better over time. I can improve. Resilience, which is, of course, the ability just to bounce back when things happen. And then optimism, which is the ability to frame things in a positive way, not always negatively. So that's one of the things we measured. We measured social support. Friends, families, and significant other. We measured supervisor support, and we actually measured one very specific thing. The literature was very clear, both in the medical literature and in positive psychology literature and other fields, that autonomy is highly related to engagement in the sense that what you do is important. That's true in the military as well. So when you start having people feel like someone's literally just looking over their shoulder and everything, they don't like that. So we measured autonomy with supervisor support, their perceptions. And then we measured this, which is a variable that is almost completely absent in the literature on wellness and burnout in the medical field. And that's unfortunate because we do meaningful work. But we measured meaningful work because the positive psychology side of things have looked at this as a highly important variable. So one of the things we found over time was that depression, burnout, and engagement as an average, a mean, didn't change much. They were significant in terms of statistics, but everybody knows you get those large numbers, these trivial changes are significant, but they're not important. So the average levels were about the same. However, any individual resident tended to go from here to here, or here to here, or this way. When I looked at the graphs, they are all over the place. So residents change quite a bit on their depression, their burnout, and their engagement levels, but the means are about the same. And that's kind of an interesting statistical trap. We use structured equation modeling here and confirmatory factor analysis, which is just a statistical technique to look at models, to look at this model. Here are the predictors of depression. So when psychological capital went up, and social support went up, and supervisor support for autonomy went up, depression went down, as predicted by their model. How about burnout? Psychological capital. The more psychological capital people reported, the less burnout. Engagement, and this to me is the most important measure. This is an overall measure of flourishing, right? Those people who know me are sick of me saying flourishing. But it's not happiness. You can make people happy with Vicodin and stuff, but flourishing is much more important. Flourishing is a bigger concept, and this is probably the better measure for that. So psychological capital, meaningful work, and supervisor support all predicted this engagement change. So if you want to enhance engagement and hence enhance retention, I'll show you that in a second, those are the things you work on. So what about resident retention? This is a big thing for HCA, and I understand it. It can be seen as a parallel goal. As a program director, I want my residents to flourish. And if flourishing means they stay with HCA, that's a win-win for me. So we definitely wanted to know about retention with HCA. There's a very strong, in fact, it was the strongest association in our predictive models between changes in engagement and their perception of wanting to stay at an HCA facility. So small changes in engagement led to large changes in their reported sense of wanting to stay at HCA facility. So how do you keep residents? It's easy to say reduce burnout, increase engagement. These coefficients here are from the confirmatory factor analysis, and I can give you more information later, but I don't want to bore people with statistics. Foster meaningful work. I know if you don't know positive psychology, when I first heard this, I said to Claremont, oh, that's a pain, I can't change that. And they literally laughed at me. They said, I've got 50 ways of framing things to increase their perception of meaningful work. And they do. And it works. Expand supervisor support for autonomy. That one you have to do training as a leadership level, because you have to train people how to act like a leader that frames things in in a way that the resident can feel autonomy. Build psychological capital. And then try to keep depression down. I'm going to skip through these very quickly because I want a little tiny bit of time for questions. So how do you reduce depression? Our model found the things that positive psychology models expected. If you want to reduce depression, increase social support. Increase PsyCap, do it early if you can. There's a bigger effect when you introduce it early. And then increase perceived supervisor support for autonomy. How about tendency for seeking help? This is fascinating, and we've seen this in other studies, and it scares the out of me. The more depressed you are as a resident, the less likely you will ask for help. Right? You would think it should go intuitively, the more depressed you are, the more likely you should ask for help, but they don't. And in all three waves, we saw that same relationship. Why? Because they don't think it'll help. In fact, they think it will hurt. And that's an almost completely proven from a statistical standpoint relationship. Residents who are more depressed will not ask you for help because they don't think it will help. And in fact, they think they'll get punished for it somehow. Military's dealt with that. And I think they've done a good job, to be honest. What about burnout? Number one. So remember I talked earlier, though, about this tendency to want to focus on individuals. So there's lots of other things we could do to reduce burnout. EHR is a big one. But in terms of residents, introducing psychological capital early. And I understand that you probably don't know what PsyCap is and all those kinds of things, but there's a lot out there, and you can influence this quite a bit. What about engagement? The model held very well on a confirmatory factor analysis. What that means is I can explain the variances in engagement by a model using these variables. So by perceived supervisor support for autonomy and meaningfulness of work and PsyCap, can I change those things as a program director? Damn straight I can. Absolutely. Did it work? I don't know. Number one is satisfaction. I can't take all that responsibility. But what I can say is kudos to Claremont. They showed me all of this before we even did this model, and we created our program around this model. And at least so far, and I measure burnout and depression in people, and I'll tell you, I still have depressed people, but so far it's working pretty well for us. This is the overall model. And I put retention with HCA up at the top. And I did that just partly because I understand some of the business model here that's important. And I'm okay with the model. I am, because it's got parallel interests. As a program director, I want people to stay with HCA if I'm at HCA, right? Here's the reduce burnout, increase engagement. That's a no-brainer, although I think we've proved it. I think the evidence is now overwhelming from a very large statistical study. So how do you do that? The size of the arrows are roughly correlated to the confirmatory factor analysis coefficients here. You increase perceived meaningfulness of work. Is that a huge investment? It ain't a huge investment. It's how you frame things. It's how you bring to the table certain, they're not, somebody once said when I told them this stuff, oh, it's a trick. It's not a trick. I believe it. I'm not manipulating anybody, but I can frame things in a very different way when I'm focused on how do I, every single day we have a didactic session, how do I do this? That is on my mind. How do I influence the residents to remember that what they did really mattered, as opposed to, let's just talk about sodium imbalance and stuff like that. And that's important too, but I need to have them learn how to thrive. Second one was this. Now that one, again, goes back to teaching the leaders how to do this. That's a style that positive psychology calls transformational leadership style. It's a different leadership style, and it does take a little bit of training to understand how to do it, but it makes a big impact on residents. You build psychological capital, and this last one, the one I didn't put on here, was that social support's very important here, especially among the people who come in on first year. So 2/3 of our people who are first years in our study had changed location. They disrupted their family and friend connections. They may have disrupted their significant others. They left their psychotherapists. They left their psychiatrists. They didn't have their medications to take for some of them. It's a very dangerous time for wellness in residence, is that first 3-month time period, and it's partly because of that. So this is the model that we used. The confirmatory factor analysis was excellent. And of course, Claremont says, now can we get on with things? Let's fix this, right? They're chomping at the bit. As an example of something here, meaningful work is based and grounded in a theory. And what I like about Claremont's positive psychology approach here is that this isn't a one-off study of wellness. This is a very well thought out, researched, and measurable field, grounded in theory. So when you look at meaningful work, for example, there are 4 components to it. So you build autonomy, and there are ways to do that. You build relatedness. What does that mean? Well, I don't want to silo either. It's important to make sure that we're all part of a team. But at the same time, I need people to feel like they're part of my group. Does that mean jackets that say emergency medicine residency? Yes, it does. Right? Does it mean ice cream socials occasionally? Yeah, that kind of thing. Competence. How often do you talk to people about fantastic, we have a thing called what went well. And what went well is a positive psychology approach which simply says, so tell me something that went well this last week during your shifts. So instead of just tell me all the bad stuff, and we'll talk about 72-hour bounce backs and all that stuff. What went well? And the residents will say, hey, I did my first LP on a newborn. How'd it go? It went great. You don't think that has a lot of impact? It has a lot of impact. It really does. It has to do with building competence and framing it to them to see it. Because when I ask the residents how are they doing, they almost uniformly go, oh, I don't think I'm doing very well. They underestimate their performance. So you need to purposefully remind them and frame it that you are improving and you're becoming more and more competent. And then that bottom one on the right, beneficence, is so important. The reason I told those stories at the beginning is the same reason. So we sometimes get caught up in this idea that we're doctors, we shouldn't be emotional. That's crap. Okay? Some of the things we do are remarkable for human beings. And to sit in front of residents and not cherish those moments is a shame. There's so much we can do to say, wow, look what you did. Especially in emergency medicine and many other specialties too. It's easy for us. We don't get to see them back often, but I can call them, I can have them come back. I can have them sit there and tell me about what happened and how important that was. Millennials, that last talk, I love the part about millennials want to change the world. They sure do. They really do. And you can use these kind of moments to show how you change the world for that person. Maybe not the world in the same way that we all think about it, but for that one person, it was the world. So you can do these things deliberately. So putting this together, these are just examples. And I only say this because I want to make it kind of operationalized a little bit. How do we do increased perceived meaningfulness at work? Remember, I showed you the different 4 components of this. So we do recognize birthdays, special events. This has probably been one of the most important things I've ever done in terms of return on investment. I handwrite. I know that sounds archaic. You can still buy cards, just really you can. I buy cards and I handwrite thank you notes to the significant others of residents who are on hard rotations where they're gone. And every time I see those significant others, they say, thank you for caring, right? That's fantastic. You don't think that pays dividends? Huge. Do I really care? I really do care. We send emails every month, and we just tell everybody where everybody's going and who's coming home. We focus on goals. We emphasize competence, the what went well criteria. We do a number of stories of impact on others, deliberately. We emphasize on what goals people have set and how they're moving towards them. We focus on the things that people have been doing that are good. That doesn't mean we ignore the remediation issues. I have to do that. And I focus on human aspects of what we do. How about the perceived supervisor support for autonomy? This one's trickier for sure. You need to learn a few things about transformational leadership style. But you can do certain things and just even the way you say stuff. So for example, in emergency medicine, someone presents to me and I say, so what do you want to do? I try to avoid saying, well, let's go do it. What do you want to do? If they give me something in the ballpark, I'll just say, okay, go do it. That makes people feel like they are freely choosing to do something that aligns with their values. That's what it means to have autonomy. If they don't, well, let's think that through a little bit. But there are ways of framing those interactions that can get people to feel like they have more autonomy than other ways of framing it. I have many fellowships. This goes throughout the entire residency program. They can pick their topics, they pick their curriculum, they build this. Why? Because they want to change the world, right? They want to develop some sort of a specialty and change the world. And they love their little mini fellowships. They develop their own curriculum, I approve it, and they move through them. How about increasing social support? This one takes a little bit of money. Not a ton, but a little bit. Team building exercises. We have a day of service events. The residents go out and they clean up parks. I didn't even organize that. They did. There's great literature. You feel bad, you feel a little depressed, go help someone. That's been studied over and over again. Go help someone else. They go out and they clean up parks in Riverside with pictures, and of course marketing's there and all that kind of stuff. It's a great way to have a social support system. We do retreats. I don't have funding for those yet, but I will, I hope. Events at attendings houses outside the hospital, joint events, add significant others. They're remarkably important. All of you know that, I suspect. We have a KIN program where first years, second years, third years, and attendings are all connected together. We do have a GME-wide buddy program that connects outside of residencies. I don't do this yet, but I sure like to. Just little regularly scheduled, inexpensive. Ice cream can't cost that much, but it builds this social support structure. I send little care packages to the residents. I mean, my program coordinator, of course, does most of that. Kathy Hameson's her name, 20 plus years of experience. She's fantastic. So we have care packages that go out to them. We do more things for the new residents. Why? Because they need it. They're struggling. We do have best upon request at our hospital, which has been very helpful. Last thing, how do you do PsyCap? Well, let me just give you a taste of what this means. So we have an orientation. We talk about what are the likely stressors and the responses that will happen. When are you likely to be the most stressed? First 3 months and between January and March of your first year. Literature is very clear. I follow it. That's what happened to our residents too. Our seniors talk to the juniors about how to deal with that. We have a values clarification. On their phones, they have their 3 top values. Mine are compassion, self-compassion, and gratitude. And every single shift I go to the emergency department, I look at that as I leave my office, and I try to live those values in that shift. I know that can sound hokey, but it makes meaningful work for me. And it does for them too, I hope. We talk about cognitive reframing. 80% of my residents, when I ask them, how many of you have fairly constant negative thoughts during your shift? 80% of them said, almost all the time. What an abysmal way to live, first of all, to constantly be berating yourself. We've done discussions with them about how to fix that. How do you challenge your cognitive framework? Dan Siegel wrote a book called Buddha's Brain, where he talks a lot about this negativity bias. Your brains were evolutionarily developed to look for the negative danger. And so you will take in negative events far more strongly than you will take in positive events. But you can overcome that, but you got to work at it, deliberately work at it. That's what the What Went Wells, we do gratitude practices. There are things you can do to overcome that negativity bias. And that negativity bias leads to burnout and depression. Goal setting. Every one of my residents knows that when they come to me, the first thing I say is, what is your goal today? And it may be, my goal today is to live my values. Suck up. You know, okay. It may be, you know what, I want to see if I can present a little bit better for first years. I want to see if I can come up with whatever. I don't know. I have my little goal that's stuck on a sticky note on my computer, because you can't ask them to do this and not model it yourself. What does that do? Well, it creates a sense that I created a goal and I was able to execute it. Now, what about HCA corporate? So when you look at the perceived meaningfulness of work, this is something corporate cannot do for us as program directors. You must do this face-to-face with your residents. But corporate could certainly help develop programs to teach the program directors how to help frame it so that they see meaning in work. There does need to be training at a leadership level. The Army does the train the trainer. They've had a fantastic Army Master Resiliency training. I think that's right, General, is that right? Yeah. And you think this is hokey. Get a bunch of drill sergeants to talk about cognitive reframing and positive response systems. And it was one of the #1 ranked programs that the Army put together. They loved it. General shaking his head, thank you. I'm a colonel, I have to, sir. So if the drill sergeants find this helpful, and they're a rough crowd, the residents can do this too, and I hope you can. So increasing social support, there does need to be a little bit of funding for this. It has to help there a little bit. And then psychological capital, I understand that's a newer concept, and there has to be some training to help understand what are the components of psychological capital and can you develop it. Now the next big step for this would be research. We need to intervene. Claremont has sent me repeated emails in the last week here as I've been trying to prepare for this. So what's our next step? When are we going to do it? What's going on? How are we going to help? They have a real value. They want to help this. Culture of respect and support. The reason I put that there is that any idea what the #1 thing that can disrupt a well thought out plan and cause burnout and depression is? #1. Nobody knows? What pisses you off the most? Emergency physicians, what ruins your shift the most? Nobody's willing to. Mike, I'll do what I do in residence. Mike. Sir. What's former military too. What annoys you the most? Inefficiency. Okay. Busy work. So that was #2 and 3. The #1 thing that can disrupt an organization is an individual who has a caustic interpersonal style, especially a leader. If you allow that person to continue and they will not change, it is very, very hard to prevent change in this direction. So that's why I put culture of respect and support. So we talked about the importance of resident physician well-being. I think I showed you that HCA, Bruce, we were not above the mean. So at least we were at the mean. We weren't better, but we weren't worse. So we do represent, just like all the other residencies here, about burnout and depression with the same rates. We talked about the HCA study, and I gave you a framework through which we can put together some sort of a larger plan to try to stop this epidemic, because we have an obligation to do something. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Greg. Since it's football season, we're going to call an audible here. I don't know if baseball has a term for that. Why don't we go ahead? We'll take 2 questions. I've got
Okay,
one over
hi.
here, and we'll take one over here.
Greg, that was great, first off, and stuff that opens our eyes and makes us think a lot. I'm Franklin Casman, a GI program director in Aventura. Back in the 1980s, some crazy event, some stupid thing happened in New York, my hometown, and that changed GME forever. Subsequently, we had a commission in New York, and rules came into effect which drastically limited the GME work hours. My question is, boy, did that make any difference whatsoever in all the things that you're showing us? And I'd be real interested to know. I assume we had some degree of depression and burnout before 1988 or whenever it was that we had those new laws. Actually, it must have been in the 90s, because I went through fully my residency doing a whole lot more than 80 hours a week. Any change? Worse, better, the same?
So there was a meta-analysis done of that topic, 2016, I believe. And what they found was that if you aggregate all the studies, there was some mild effects that were positive on residents, but it was quite mild. I mean, the overall effect was not huge, but it was in the positive direction, at least. Now, there are unintended harms to that, and whether the unintended harms to the work duty hours are counterbalance that slight increase in wellness that was seen, I'm not sure. There were several studies that show no difference, by the way. But the aggregate of those meta-analyses, if you buy meta-analyses, was a slight increase in wellness after the work duty hours came out. And I can give you the reference if you want to see it, but it is one of those papers that in my mind was statistically important, but is almost saying, you know, a lot of effort for not much, no bang for the buck. And I think there are some serious harms that come from it.
Hey, Greg, it's Thomas Matisse. Thank you so much. That was very engaging and rewarding. My question to you is, as an emergency physician, kindred soul, how do you, while being mindful of well-being, how do you develop and encourage resiliency for those hard moments that they actually have to live through and come out the other side? And it could be within a shift.
Yeah. So there's lots of hard moments, and it's a good question. And of course, emergency medicine has a lot of emotional issues, why I went into it from clinical psychology, I think. We actually talk about those issues. There's no evidence on this, I'll point out. Nobody has ever done a study on how do you relieve what's been called empathic distress. Empathic distress is the crap that happens after the 7th time you've told somebody their child's dead, right? Most people don't have to go, in the community, most people never go through that their whole life. You and I and everyone else may have to do that repeatedly. And that has a huge impact on the mirror neurons in the brain. And if you do what most emergency physicians do, which is you sit there watching the tears, and then you turn around and pick up a chart and go see someone else who's sitting there like this, like, how come I've been waiting so long? It's really tough. And if you take that home, you use alcohol, drugs, sex, something else to deal with that. And so one of the things we're doing is we are teaching how do you deal with those things. And from my training, we're doing rituals and some other things. That's not for everybody, but we do give a toolkit of how to deal with those tough situations. And it varies from person to person. Some people are just not going to be someone to do rituals. I write down the names of everybody who's died with me, and I put it in a little ceramic jar that I have in my office, so it's HIPAA compliant. At the end of a certain time period, I do some things and I burn those all and I put them in my garden. And that's just a ritual I have. But it helps me get rid of some of those things. But I don't know the answer because there's no evidence. No one's ever studied it. If anybody wants to, let me know. It's a great question.
Thank you so much.